Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to Fed by Fire. I'm Christian. Tonight we're going to be talking about Nickolas Madurro, the president of Venezuela, who was captured by the U.S. in a large-scale military in Caracas in the early hours of January 3rd, 2026, and flown out to the country along with his wife, Celia Flores. We're going to be breaking down all that tonight and talk about the basic facts. So, U.S. Donald Trump, he announced that the U.S. military conducted a large-scale strike against Venezuela. They have been, and they did on this day, and that Maduro and his wife, that they were captured, and that they were moved from Venezuela, and that they were being extradited to the U.S. Both were taken by helicopter to the U.S., and, then they were transferred to New York, where Maduro is expected to face federal charges, including narco-terrorism as well as drug trafficking counts. And, we saw Donald Trump say that he had plenty of chances to turn himself in, but Venezuelan would describe the event as a kidnapping carried out at Maduro's residence inside the Fort Tiana military complex near Caracas. And how the capture happened was, the operation was reportedly executed by the U.S. Army Delta Force, them bad boys guarded by the CIA intelligence, and they don't play no games. And that they had mapped Maduro's movements over several months, so he was under heavy surveillance, and explosions and strikes, they were reported going across Caracas, including at military installations and helicopter bases. It was all part of a broader attack created, as a window so they could seize Maduro. In general, Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he said that Trump authorized the raid late Friday and that the mission, the code name for it was Absolute Resolve, and that it took over a little 2 hours from insertion to exfiltration and legal. And the political angle we're going to talk about was Maduro had already been under U.S. indictment related to the alleged narco-terrorism and the collaboration with the elements of the so-called Cartel de los Soles. And the Justice Department, they now issued a superseding indictment, so it's just expanding those charges, making his situation a lot worse. But, Trump has publicly linked Maduro to the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, but we're not how clear that connection is. And he framed the strike as part of a broader campaign against drug trafficking and foreign terrorist organizations. We've heard that a lot on this channel, although U.S. intelligence assessments have said that there is no firm evidence, like we just said, tying Maduro personally to Tren de Aragua, and that Venezuela is not a major source of U.S. drug flows. But Trump has said that the U.S. will temporarily run the country in the coordination with a team of U.S. officials, and that Venezuelan partners are raising major questions about sovereignty, international law, and whether this amounts to a de facto regime change intervention. But the situation now, Maduro and Celia Flores, they are in U.S. custody. And, they have already been transferred to New York, and they were arraigned on their federal charges by now, I believe. Venezuela has declared a national emergency and mobilized the remaining security forces and demanded proof that Maduro is still alive and being treated lawfully. So, globally, reactions are sharply divided. U.S. allies are cautious or silent so far, while countries like Russia have, condemned that the strikes, they saw it as an illegal act of aggression against a sovereign state to begin with. So let's talk about the months before the raid, what led us up to this. The U.S. steadily escalated, the term a drug war and sanctions campaign against Venezuela under Trump, rebranding Maduro as his security apparatus as a narco-terrorist cartel and then rolling it into an open military action. This escalation laid the legal and political groundwork for the operation that ended with his capture. So you just got to understand that. And let's talk about some of the long-term background. The U.S. first indicted Maduro back in 2020 on narco-terrorism charges, blow trafficking, corruption charges tied to so-called Cartel de los Soles, and alleged cooperation with FARC, framing him as a criminal rather than just a political adversary. So he had all that going on, and over the next years, Washington, they layered, heavy oil and financial sanctions on Venezuela for these reasons, just to officially pressure Maduro out, and more recently, explicitly, to target what it labeled a narco-terrorist regime. In Trump's 2020-25 policy shifts on January 20th, 2025, Trump signed on an executive order letting the U.S. label cartels and criminal networks as foreign terrorist organizations, and we've seen that change the game a lot. U.S. officials then described the Cartel de los Soles, allegedly headed by Maduro. They said that it was a terrorist group. They supposedly linked it to the Sinaloa cartel as well. But it seems like they're just trying to paint a really big picture. And throughout 2020-25, Trump publicly tied Venezuela to drug trafficking and irregular migration, even as U.S. intelligence reportedly pushed back on the claim that Venezuela was a primary source of drugs reaching the U.S. I don't know who really has proof of that, but military buildup and the strikes by mid to late 2020-25, the U.S. had moved a naval task force and warships into the Caribbean and off of Venezuela's coast, calling this part of the campaign against a narco-terrorist state, shipping and smuggling networks, trying to disrupt those if there were any. And between November and the end of December 2020-25, U.S. forces had carried out over dozens of strikes on alleged drug smuggling boats, so they say, and instructed to kill multiple people at sea, signaling a steady normalization of armed action around, these kind of acts, trying to send a real message. Sanctions and blockade pressure in early December 2020-25, the U.S. seized at least one Venezuelan oil tanker carrying roughly 2 million barrels of crude, calling it part of an illicit terrorist network. They're just throwing this terrorist word all around. But Caracas, they said it was piracy. On December 16th, Trump announced a blockade on sanctioned tankers entering or leaving Venezuela and vowed to keep tightening the noose on the oil-dependent economy until Venezuela returned the U.S. oil, land, and assets, and language that alarmed many observers as near open talk of resource seizure. brought a lot of attention. In the final days before the raid, in the last weeks of December 2025, U.S. Southern Command reported repeated lethal strikes on suspected drug smuggling vessels, while Washington simultaneously added that more Venezuelan oil firms and tankers to sanctions list, further isolating the country. That, it was a lot going on. On January 1st, 2026, Maduro appeared on the Venezuelan state TV offering to negotiate an agreement with the U.S. on the drug trafficking, but he accused Washington of using the cartel narrative as a cover just to push regime change and grab Venezuela's oil. So he was trying to say they were just trying to control the narrative. And behind the scenes, Trump had already authorized the CIA to run covert operations inside Venezuela. And by October 2025, they were openly saying that he was considering ground operations, which U.S. military planners then rehearsed for months for this mission. And Trump had already authorized it, and, there's just not much he could do. And I don't know what Mr. Maduro is feeling right now, but I bet he is feeling the full weight of the American justice system, and who knows what his wife had happened. But by the time the raid had launched on the early hours of January 2nd to 3rd of 2026, they had legally framed Maduro and his circle to terrorist-linked narco-trafficking and built a sanctions and blockade and regime that treated Venezuela like a hostile cartel-run state. So these were all figures that played in his demise, and he was normalizing an ongoing kinetic strikes in and around Venezuela territory. And, we'll be giving updates as this case goes on. I'll be filming, the series about my life soon. But as the week goes on, we're going to be breaking down some more cases. Thank you guys for watching. Peace.